Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on the educational attainment. So we're really excited that you're all here joining us today. So today it's a little bit different than what we've done in the past on the Educational Attainment Index, because we're going to be taking a deeper dive into understanding the indices with the hope that this will allow you to have a better understanding of the attainment indices that have been produced by the consortium and the To&Through project, and allow you to apply it to the work that you are doing in your district and schools. So I'm Jenny Nagaoka. I'm the Deputy Director at the Consortium on School Research. I will be joined by Alex Usher, who's an Associate Director at the To&Through project, and Shelby Mahaffey, who's a Research Analyst with the To&Through project and the Consortium on School Research. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Consortium and the To&Through project, the Consortium on School Research are both based at the University of Chicago and what was formerly known as SSA, but is now known as the Crown Family School of Social Work Policy and Practice. The consortium has been around for a little over 30 years, and we do research that is meant to be actionable for policy and practice in the Chicago public schools. The To&Through project draws on the research of the consortium and engages in data and dialogue to help guide practitioners and policymakers in improving their school outcomes. And so what we'll be talking about today is a report on the left, which is a report that came out in late December of 2020, where we go through the educational attainment of Chicago public school students and going through the different milestones and going much more deeply into the attainment indices. We also, like normally for the To&Through project, we're in person and we provide you with a hard copy of data insights, but because we're all in a virtual world right now, we've produced the data insights at an online version that and that highlights different findings from the consortium and the To&Through project, and also shows some of the indices that we'll be showing you today. We're going to be having a couple of events. So we have the webinar today, but we also will be having an event on March 2nd, which will be a panel discussion on the education debt for young Black men in Chicago public schools. That will be moderated by the To&Through project's Don McCoy, and we'll be joined by our colleagues from CPS, the Partnership for College Completion. On March 16th, there will be a To&Through research spotlight on linking social emotional learning to long-term success. That will feature John Easton from the consortium and Shanette Porter. And they'll be sharing results from a project that has been led by Bo Jackson from Northwestern University that has received a lot of attention. Okay, so to give you a quick run through of what we'll be talking about today, I'll start us off with providing a little bit of background on the Postsecondary Attainment Index and its history. I'll turn it over to Shelby, who will talk about some of the strengths and limitations of the National Student Clearinghouse data. So the National Student Clearinghouse data is the foundation for all of the numbers that we share with you on college enrollment and completion. She'll then provide a deeper description on 3 of the attainment indices and talk to you about how those are calculated and how they're used. And then she'll turn it over to Alex, and Alex will show you something that we're really excited about, which is an online tool that will allow you to calculate your own post-secondary attainment indices. And at the end, we'll have some time for questions. In the short term, if you do have some questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. We'll be responding to some of them throughout the presentation, but we'll also share some of, we'll also save some of them for the end during our Q&A session. But please feel free to jump in with any questions that you have. So I want to provide a little bit of background on the Attainment Index. And this actually goes back to 2006 with a report that came out by the Consortium, and it made a lot of headlines. So actually the number that we see in this headline, which I think a lot of you are familiar with, is actually just a paragraph of the first report of a project that was looking at the post-secondary attainment of Chicago public school graduates that was led by Melissa Roderick. And it was really, at the time, just a back of the envelope calculation of what we thought would happen to current CPS freshmen. So we just grabbed a high school graduation rate from an earlier report and the college and four-year college enrollment rate and the four-year college completion rate that was in that report. And this was really just meant as a way of thinking about and summarizing a lot of the performance, what was happening in the district. This turned into a big moment in the history of thinking about college, supporting college access for Chicago public school graduates in Chicago. It was a little bit difficult because I think this was a number that nobody had seen before, and it was really a shocking number. It also spurred a lot of action in the nonprofit community. A lot of people saw this and thought this is really something that we need to organize and provide additional support. And it also was a big moment for the Chicago Public Schools. They had been working on high school graduation and college enrollment, but it really spurred a lot more action inside the district as well. And to their credit, they really owned this issue around improving educational attainment and have invested a tremendous amount of resources in making sure that this number was not the actual reality for the students that were freshmen in Chicago Public Schools at the time. So, so that was in 2006. And for the past 5 years, the To&Through project and the consortium has been providing annual updates of that number in addition to how Chicago Public School students were doing on different educational milestones. And so this has been a way of monitoring progress, summarizing it, and really highlighting some of the places where there have been successes and where future efforts need to be focused. Accompanying the annual attainment reports, the To&Through project also has an online tool. So the reports themselves show what attainment has looked like at the district level, but for these numbers to be useful for school practitioners and the larger education stakeholder community, the online tool provides the same sorts of numbers at the school level. And in addition to numbers at the school level, it also shows trends over time and how these numbers look for subgroups within different schools. So I also wanted to turn to the question that is sort of central to this whole webinar. So why should we use an education attainment index? So initially, it was a way of providing a high-level number of what was happening inside the district and to project what future attainment would look like if the current numbers held. So this is really different than I think traditionally how we think about college completion and in terms of the district, because generally we would follow a single cohort and follow what they did over time. But following a cohort requires students to actually age and go through the educational process. And so it tells us what happened in the past, but with the index, it allows us to think about what will happen in the future if the current rates of high school graduation, college enrollment, and college completion hold. And so on one hand, it provides a high level number, but a lot of what we also want to do with this is to have people focus on the specific milestones that are a part of a larger level of attainment indices. Another thing that has been really useful is being able to measure progress. The Chicago Tribune headline stuck in a lot of people's heads, and things have changed. And Shelby and Alex will show you a little bit more about how much it's changed, but it's really been a way for us to see the progress that has been made in Chicago over the past 15 years. Another thing that the attainment indices have allowed us to do is kind of build momentum around efforts to increase high school graduation, college access, and college completion. It's something that people can see. They start this sort of a call to action around figuring out ways to better support CPS students, and has really been a way of organizing efforts across the education community in Chicago. So one of the things, I also want to take a little bit step back from what I've been talking about, because this is something that has shaped a lot of the work that's been going on at the To&Through project and at the Consortium. Over the past few years, we've been thinking a lot about the role of racial equity and in the work that we do. 2020 was obviously a year that brought into sharp focus a lot of things that we've been thinking about, from how the pandemic really exacerbated existing inequities in our society, and then also the racial reckoning that was accelerated by the murder of George Floyd. So we've been thinking a lot about the limitations of data and the perspectives that we take. We also want to give a shout out to our colleagues at Chicago Beyond, who did a really great job in their report, Why Am I Always Being Researched, of really calling into sharp focus some of the assumptions that happen when we're showing research and numbers. One of the things I want to mention too is that the data that we'll be sharing with you is descriptive, so the Educational Attainment Index and other milestones are strictly descriptive numbers, meaning that we're showing where things are happening, when things are happening, and for whom, but we're not delving into the deeper questions of why we're seeing these numbers. And sometimes in education, we really think it's an important part of our role to highlight in careful detail, what is happening, so that practitioners can see how their students are performing and what the impact of their practice is. But this does run into the risk that as readers are seeing these numbers, that they can intentionally or unintentionally ascribe these outcomes that we're describing to the choices and capacities of students, families, and communities, particularly among people of color. So one of the things that we want to call attention to for this presentation and all the work that we do is to think a lot more about the context in which we're seeing these numbers. In Chicago, there is a long history of systemic racism that's included the intentional economic and educational disinvestment in communities of color. So a lot of the difference that we see by race are due to racial structures and embedded beliefs that shape the outcomes that we see among students. And I think one of the things that what we don't show in this report, but we think is also really important for people as they are looking at these numbers, is to really be soliciting the perspectives of students and families about their experiences, particularly within school. And so it's really important when we're looking at these numbers that they're being done in dialogue with the experiences of students. And so we understand the factors that shape the outcomes that we are seeing. And from here, I will turn it over to Shelby, who will talk about the National Student Clearinghouse data, which underlies a lot of the numbers that we are showing you.
Thanks, Jenny. So for those who don't know, the foundation for many of the college enrollment and outcome numbers that we use historically has been data from the National Student Clearinghouse, or NSC. NSC serves as a national central repository for college enrollment and completion data. And this is the data source that we use at To&Through and at the Consortium, and that CPS uses to report rates of college enrollment, college persistence, and college completion. However, there are some known limitations of the data from NSC, including incomplete certificate and degree information, incomplete coverage of institutions and at the student level, and also the potential for matching errors at the student level between the records that an organization is asking NSC for data on, and then the records that NSC has at the student level. So one key limitation in particular, the inability to reliably distinguish between credential types that students earn at individual institutions in the past has made us hesitant to report students' completion outcomes at two-year institutions, especially because many credential records actually lacked information altogether about what type of credential students had earned. And we actually hadn't reported on two-year outcomes in the past for that reason. We'd reported on students' enrollment at two-year institutions, but not at whether they'd completed associate degrees or other types of certificates because of this data limitation with the NSC data. However, we recently completed an analytic project in which we used data from the Illinois Community College Board, or ICCB, to expand our understanding of what those limitations are in the NSC data, and specifically to look at what the outcomes were for those students who had blank completions in the NSC data. So what we did is we compared CPS graduates' enrollment and completion records in the National Student Clearinghouse data that we had to the enrollment and completion records of the same students in the data that came more directly from the Illinois Community College Board. And so if you're interested in the details of that process or in our findings, Jenny and I actually wrote a technical brief about this analysis. It's called Tracking Two-Year College Outcomes, and you can find it in the chat. But today we just wanted to highlight a few of the key findings from that brief about the National Student Clearinghouse data and about the implications for calculating the types of indices that we're going to be talking about today. So our first key takeaway is that NSC data does seem to be a reliable source of data about CPS graduates' two-year enrollment and their completion of, and whether or not they completed any credential in a two-year college. So in our analysis, we found that 96% of CPS graduates had matching immediate enrollment outcomes according to the NSC and ICCB data sets, and also that for 96% of two-year enrollees, the two data sets were also aligned on whether the student had earned any credential from a two-year institution. We did find that there were a small number of records that were present in the ICCB data that were missing from our NSC data, and it is possible that certain groups of students, such as undocumented students, for example, are overrepresented in this group that isn't covered by NSC. Our other main finding was that we are not able to use NSC as a reliable source of data about which credentials students had earned from two-year institutions. So most, but not all, of the CPS graduates with blank completions in the NSC data had earned associate degrees. And this finding, even though we are not able to distinguish between the types of credentials that students earned, the finding that most of the blank completions were associate degrees and that most students who were completing anything from a two-year college were completing associate degrees helped us make the decision to report rates of completion of any credential from two-year colleges using the NSC data, and to trust that that's a meaningful metric of students' attainment at two-year colleges. Most CPS graduates with blank completions in the NSC data had earned an associate degree. And then our final finding from this analysis is that the full-time status field in the NSC data was less similar to the full-time status in the ICCB data than the relationship between other variables. So I think we're not going to use the full-time status indicator in the NSC data, knowing that it doesn't match up exactly with what we're seeing in the ICCB data. So to summarize some of our takeaways about the NSC data, I think our view of the strengths of NSC data didn't change that much. There are some really important strengths that I think we've kind of always known. We receive NSC data pretty consistently in a consistent format. It's very comprehensive in that it includes data on both enrollment and completion and data from both 2-year and 4-year institutions. And it has national coverage, not just in Illinois. It covers institutions associated with 97% of all 2-year enrollments nationally. However, this comparison to the ICCB data did also highlight for us some limitations of the NSC data that we think are important to keep in mind when working with NSC data in general, and especially when calculating these types of indices. So one is that the information in the NSC data is limited. There are those blank degrees, which can't necessarily be interpreted as necessarily meaning that a student completed one specific type of credential. And also the variables related to students' programs and their credits towards completion, what they're studying, those types of things are very limited compared to other potential sources of data. And then as I talked about, there is that potentially unrepresentative sample and also incomplete coverage at the institution and student level, which means that we know that the NSC data isn't a perfect summary of whether students are enrolling in college and completing. And so again, if you're interested in more detail about these findings or about the process, I definitely encourage you to check out the report that I mentioned in the chat, and also our NSC resource guide, which I think May is also linking in the chat. So for the remainder of this presentation, we're going to be talking about 3 different indices of post-secondary attainment. They're all closely related, but they are 3 slightly different ways of thinking about how to summarize CPS students' post-secondary attainment using current rates of high school graduation, college enrollment, and college completion. They all serve slightly different purposes, which we'll get into as we talk about each one, but all 3 of the indices are essentially estimates of what CPS, of what graduates' post-secondary attainment will look like if current rates do not change. And of course, we expect that these rates will change over the next 10 years. And these indices are actually one way of hopefully thinking about the impact of what changes in the specific rates, what impact those changes might have on the big picture of post-secondary attainment for all students. So on the next slide, these are the 3 indices that we're going to highlight today. So the first is the direct bachelor's degree attainment index. This is the simplest of the 3, and it estimates the proportion of CPS freshmen who will earn a bachelor's degree within 10 years through a direct pathway by immediately enrolling in a 4-year college after graduation. The next one, the bachelor's degree attainment index, it estimates a similar outcome, but it also incorporates other pathways to a bachelor's degree, including delaying enrollment in college or immediately enrolling in a 2-year college rather than a 4-year college. And then finally, we'll talk about the new index, which we calculated for the first time this year, and that is the post-secondary attainment index, which estimates the proportion of CPS freshmen who will earn any credential within 10 years, including associate degrees and certificates, in addition to bachelor's degrees. So we're starting here on the next slide with the bachelor's degree, the direct bachelor's degree attainment index, which estimates the proportion of CPS freshmen who will go on to earn a bachelor's degree within 10 years through a direct pathway, which means that they graduate from high school within 4 years, immediately enroll in a 4-year college after graduating from high school, and then earn a bachelor's degree within 6 years. So like I said, this is the simplest of the 3 indices, and it only requires 3 numbers to calculate. We take the current high school graduation rate and multiply it by the current 4-year college enrollment rate among high school graduates, and then finally multiply in the rate of bachelor degree completion among immediate 4-year enrollees. So essentially what we're doing is taking the most recent year of data for each of the 3 key milestones along the path to a 4-year college degree, along the direct path to a 4-year college degree. So we continue to calculate this number to update that original 6% number that Jenny mentioned. Another advantage of this index is that because it's so simple, it's possible to calculate a national comparison for this number, and also to see most directly the impact of a change in the immediate 4-year college enrollment rate on estimated post-secondary attainment in general. However, we also do think that it's important to consider other pathways that students are taking to a bachelor's degree, including immediate enrollment in a 2-year institution and delayed enrollment into college. So for the bachelor's degree attainment index, we start the calculation the same way with those same 3 rates that we talked about, but then we also add in the proportion of students who will immediately enroll in a 2-year college and go on to earn a bachelor's degree within 6 years, and also the proportion of students who delay enrollment into college, don't immediately enroll in college after graduation, and then do go on to earn a bachelor's degree within 6 years of high school graduation. And then we add all 3 of those pathways together to get this second index, which is the bachelor's degree attainment index. So one way of thinking about both of these indices is to imagine them following 100 current 9th graders through all of the milestones over 10 years. For example, for CPS, this figure shows how the bachelor's degree attainment index breaks down for 100 current CPS freshmen. So if rates don't change, then out of 100 current CPS freshmen, 82 will graduate from high school within 4 years. That's the current high school graduation rate at CPS, 82%. Then out of those 82 graduates, 37 would immediately enroll in a 4-year college, and 18 would immediately enroll in a 2-year college based on the current college enrollment rates. Then a total of 20 of the original 100 freshmen would ultimately earn a bachelor's degree within 10 years. 18 of the 37 students who immediately enrolled in a 4-year college, and then an additional 1 of the 18 students who immediately enrolled in a 2-year college, and 1 of the students who delayed enrollment into college. So those numbers sum to a total bachelor degree attainment index of 20%. Again, meaning that if current rates don't change, 20% of current CPS freshmen will earn a bachelor's degree within 10 years. So on the slide, you can actually also see the direct bachelor's degree attainment index, that first index that we talked about, the simpler one, by just looking at the blue sections here and ignoring the green sections. And actually that final blue bar shows the direct bachelor's degree attainment index, which is 18%. And that means that if current rates don't change, 18% of CPS freshmen will earn a bachelor's degree through a direct pathway within 10 years. And now I'm going to hand over to Alex to talk about the last of the 3 attainment indices, the post-secondary attainment index.
Thank you, Shelby. So the post-secondary attainment index, as Shelby noted earlier, is where we are including for the first time 2-year associate degrees and certificates. And this attainment index looks really, really similar to the bachelor's degree attainment index, except as you can see in that sort of 3rd column right there, instead of looking at the completion rate, the bachelor's degree completion rate, or the degree to which students are earning bachelor's degrees, in this index, for the first time, we're looking at any completion. So it could be a bachelor's degree, but it could also be a 2-year associate's degree or a certificate. And when we do this, we get the post-secondary attainment index, or as we call it, the PAI. Now, very, very similarly, as another way to think about this is to think about starting with 100 students. And just like Shelby did a few slides ago, if we start with 100 students, this is, and the current rates hold over the next 10 years. They don't have to hold. We could see these rates improve, But if they do hold over the next 10 years, here's what we know will happen. As Shelby mentioned, 82 students will graduate from high school. That's CPS's high school enrollment rate. 37 will enroll directly in a four-year college, and 18 will enroll in a two-year college. So to this point, it's exactly the same. Where it's going to start to change is right here. Of those 37 who enroll in a four-year college, 20 will earn a degree or certificate. Of the 18 who enroll in a two-year college, 5 will earn a degree or certificate. And then another 2 students who did not enroll directly in college will earn a degree or certificate. And that gives us 27 of our original freshmen earning a college credential, any college credential, within 10 years. So again, for CPS, if the numbers remain the same, if the rates remain the same, and they don't have to, but if they do remain the same over the next 10 years, we know that 27 out of 100 of today's freshmen will earn a college credential, a bachelor's degree, an associate's degree, or a certificate in 10 years. Now, this slide, the next slide that we're going to look at breaks the PAI down for students of different race, ethnicity, and gender groups. And as Jenny mentioned earlier, in a city like Chicago, which with a long history and present reality of segregation and systemic racism, it's vital that we take a hard look at rates broken down this way, even though it's difficult, in order to understand the different educational experiences that different groups of CPS students are having. It's also important to know that these averages don't represent all cities in the school, all schools in the city, and to say really, really clearly that they don't in any way speak to the capacity of students from different groups. These rates are instead a reflection of the systemic racism that continues to plague our country, our school system, and ourselves. In addition to the PAI rates all the way on the right, and actually here you can see all 3 indexes that we've talked about today for each of these different groups. It's important to think about these high-level indices can sometimes mask important differences. So as an example, if we look at Latino young men, we'll see that although their rate of bachelor's completion is close to the district average, their rate of 4-year enrollment is lower, significantly lower. And the opposite is actually true for young Black men who have a 4-year enrollment rate that's close to the district average, but a bachelor's degree completion rate that is significantly behind the district average. And this can ask us to, push us to ask really important questions about different educational experiences for different groups, to pursue qualitative or other investigations of why, of the experiences that Latino young men have in the enrollment process and that Black young men have in the completion process. The final thing I just want to note here is just to remind us all that these rates are not prescriptive, right? They represent what will happen if our current rates hold, but our current rates can and must improve. And if they do improve, the rates for these different groups will change and will be different 10 years from now when we look back at their cohort rates. I just want to remind everyone as we kind of begin to move to the end, but don't leave yet. We've got a really exciting tool to show you that we have a data insights that May put in the chat earlier. We also have the educational attainment report, which describes everything we're talking about here in a lot more detail. The final thing that I want to show you, the other thing I want to note is we've got some really exciting research coming up over the course of the next 6 to 9 months. In the spring, we'll be looking at college pathways and taking a deep dive into college leave and transfers. And the other thing we're looking at very closely right now is college enrollment and retention for the class of 2020. And we'll be talking a little bit, we'll be sort of publishing that in spring. And then finally, we are doing a new version of our tool that looks at where students live and the different communities they come from. And we'll be releasing an online brief in addition to that new tool. But right now, I want to show you a new tool here. We call this our PAI calculator, and we just released this. So going to ask Alex here to scroll over to the calculator. You can find the calculator from the To&Through website. Once you're on the To&Through website, and you click on data, you'll get to this page. On the far left, you'll get to our online tool, if you want to look at that. When we do have our new community tool, that will be right there, that says coming soon. Our pathways tool to the right of that, we're excited, we'll be releasing that in the spring. Right now, you can click on the post-secondary attainment calculator. This is the PAI calculator. And what we've done here is trying to create just a very simple, easy to use tool that will allow people to either put your own rates in here for your district or your nonprofit so that you can calculate a post-secondary attainment index for yourself. Or if you don't come from a district or a nonprofit, but you want to understand kind of how these different how improving different rates would affect the post-secondary attainment index, you can do that here too. What we've done here is we've included the base rates right now for Chicago public school students. And so you can see all of those rates here. But what we can do now is we can say, for example, what would happen to the PAI if we improved the high school graduation rate in Chicago from 82%, let's say, to 90%. And you can see the PAI at the bottom there went up from 27% to 30%. So that would be one way to improve the PAI. Let's go back to the original, which I think is 82%. But we could also look at one of the rates that's been frustratingly stagnant over the last, really 15 years or so is the four-year college graduate, or the attainment rate, the completion rate of four-year college enrollees, which has been stuck at about 54%. What if we were able as a city to move that rate from about 50% to 75%? That would take our PAI from 27% all the way up to 35%. So it's these types of kind of exercises that we think will be helpful for you as you put your own data in here, or as you just think strategically about what changes in these different rates could and would mean for the city of Chicago, or for your organization or school district. With the final thing I wanted to show you here is where it says show equation. If you want to click that, you can see some of the math behind how we calculate the PAI. So this will help you just kind of understand exactly how we go about calculating our post-secondary attainment index. And it is just an easy way to kind of understand just the relatively simple, but sometimes it can be complicated, multiplication and addition that goes into calculating a PAI. All right. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dom McCoy, who's going to facilitate a panel with some of the questions that you all have submitted over the past 40 minutes.
Great. Thank you, team. So before we get into some of these questions, just want to encourage everyone to continue to send those questions in via the chat or the Q&A box, so we can make sure all the other participants can see your questions. But I'm going to start with a question that we've gotten. Diane is asking, curious about how you talk about helping practitioners unpack the PAI. It seems that it seems encouraging that numbers are getting higher, but how do we know anything about the quality of a certificate or kind of the outcomes of what people are doing with these degrees?
I guess I can get started with a response to that. I mean, I think it is one of the pieces of like the PAI. It's like this high level number. And I think it sort of is a nice way of summarizing what we see. But I think part of like what we try to do in the report and on the online tool is really push people to take apart the pieces within the PAI. So within schools and within districts, people can start to think about where are the places that specific attention needs to be happening. So it's not just like, oh, this is what's going to happen in the future, but really to sort of say, what can we do about this now? Is it about our high school graduation rate? Is it about college enrollment? Is it about what's happening to students after they reach college campuses? And then real quickly about like the quality of certificates. I mean, I think that's an open question in a lot of ways. I mean, we don't see that in our data. I mean, locally, the city colleges of Chicago have been doing a lot to take a closer look at the programs that they are offering within their colleges to make sure that they are of economic value. But that is an effort that is happening within CCC. It's not something that we specifically have taken a closer look at or we're able to understand through the data that we currently have. The consortium has started a partnership with CCC, so we're hoping in the future that we'll have some research that may illuminate more on that question. But at this point in time, we don't have a clear answer to that.
We've gotten some questions about national comparisons. So wondering if we could share a little bit about the national comparisons that we have for CPS numbers.
Shelby, you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. So the index that we're most able to calculate a direct comparison for at the national level is the direct bachelor's degree attainment index. And there, the national number that we calculated using the data from NCES is about 23%, and CPS's direct bachelor's degree attainment index is about 18%. And the other indices, it's a little bit trickier to calculate a direct comparison for, but I can put some of the component rates in the chat for those who are interested.
Shelby.
And I think it's important just to note to that point that that's one of the reasons that the national rate is important to raise. And ideally we would have a national PAI. But sometimes when people initially see, for example, the PAI at 27 or the DAI at 20, 21, the reaction that people have is, oh my gosh, that is so low. How is it that only 27 out of 100 CPS freshmen are earning any degree or certificate 10 years later, or will earn it if the rates stay the same? And I think that reaction is important, like that we want, that's part of the reason we do this. We want people to have that reaction. We need to have that conversation, but we also need to acknowledge that, 27 likely isn't that far below the national rate. And so it's, I think, important both to sort of, sort of shock people into saying, wow, most of our students right now are, if we keep doing what we're doing now, most of our students are not going to earn a bachelor's degree or certificate. And that's also true about the country.
Yeah, and I would say, I think the thing Delta to point out is that the places where CPS graduates perform most closely to the national numbers are high school graduation and four-year college enrollment, and which are actually the places that CPS has the greatest influence over what happens to their students. There's a bigger gap between four-year college completion and two-year college completion among CPS graduates and the national numbers. But that's also a lot of what is driving the numbers that are lower than what we would expect. nationally. So I think part of what this tells me is that a lot of this is, so certainly high school plays an important role in the attainment index, but ultimately there's also a really big role for higher ed to be playing, and that this is a national problem, not just something that is happening locally among CPS graduates or among the local higher ed institution.
We got a question from Carlo. Given how much more likely it is for students are to graduate with a bachelor's degree if they go immediately to a 4-year college rather than going to a 2-year college after high school, are you worried that changing over the PAI might muddle the messaging by equating a 2-year and 4-year pathways equally beneficial?
Good question. I mean, it's, I think partially like why we show both is because they tell us different things. Having the PAI, which summarizes all the pathways, gives us a bigger picture of like what happens to all CPS graduates. If we're really trying to be thinking about what is happening to the most direct path, the path that is, at least up to this point in time, it leads to the highest probability of completion, then the direct DAI is a lot more useful. And so there is a chance that it's muddying it, but we also want to make sure that we are acknowledging that students do take very different pathways to a 4-year degree, even if direct enrolling immediately is the pathway with the highest likelihood of success.
And then slightly related, there's a couple questions here just to get the team's thoughts on what we feel are the areas of opportunity when we think about raising the Chicago PAI. Where might be some of the opportunities of focus for us as a system?
So I can jump in there for a second. I mean, I think, Chicago's high school graduation rate has gone up over the past, 15 years from, about 60%. 15 years ago, it's now at 82%. We still have a ways to go. We need to get that number up to 100%. 100% of CPS freshmen should be graduating from high school. And that number has continued to go up steadily over the past, 10, 15 years. The numbers that have, really been stagnant are the completion rates, the completion rates, both 2-year and 4-year completion rates for college enrollees. And I think that if there's any place here to really kind of focus our attention, it is in those completion rates. What's tricky there is it requires a host of different systems to work together. If we want to improve the CPS's graduation rate, that is one system. Yes, it's 150 schools, but it's one system. When we are working to improve the completion rate for CPS graduates, that means we need to work together across multiple systems: higher ed, CPS, city colleges, nonprofits. Everyone needs to be working together as sort of a larger system. And I think that is what is so challenging and what has kind of led that rate to be so stagnant over the last decade.
Yeah, I guess real quickly, and I think CPS has made tremendous progress in high school graduation, but I think at this point, I think that what they've been doing has been really effective. I think now, and I think this is actually what is happening within CPS, is that there's a lot of efforts to be looking hard to think about what else can be done, because the students who aren't graduating now probably need more intensive supports to make sure that they are having the kind of experience within high school that leads to them graduating and ideally going on to post-secondary education. And so it's not just doing more of the same, but really trying to figure out some new strategies. On the higher education side, particularly around college enrollment, I think, we obviously think like it's important for students to go on to post-secondary education, particularly making immediate transition. But it's also going to be important that there's an emphasis on the college choices that students are making. So kind of a quality of what kind of choices they're making, and not simply just going to college for the sake of going to college, because we want to make sure that students are going to a college where they're likely to be successful. So places where they have higher graduation rates and that also are providing the kind of environment where it's supporting students that they are likely to actually not just enroll in college, but to end up with a credential at the end of it. Because it's also been, we've been hearing a lot about about how there's this crisis where there's a lot of students who go to college, don't complete, and end up with huge student loan debts. And so that is also a problem that we want to be avoiding for CPS graduates.
We have a question about working with NSC data. Rigo shares that internally tracking their alums, their numbers indicate that enrollments oftentimes are higher than what is being reported in the NSC data. So wondering if there's any guidance that we can offer around ways to maybe minimize those errors or opportunities to correct that data.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like we kind of are working with the data that we receive from CPS. So there's some limitations there. CPS does have a process where schools can follow up and say we have external validation of the numbers that of actual enrollment numbers. So I think there's a lot of this is like, we're using data, and data are it's sort of gives us a good big picture view of what's happening. It's also, I think at the school level, it becomes important that there's not solely a reliance on data, that there's also a lot of work to be reaching out to students, talking to them, finding out what their college enrollment actually looks like, and verifying some of the patterns that you see or the gaps that you see in data.
So one last question. There's a lot of questions about opportunities to better understand kind of the completion stories for CPS students. And I know we have some work coming down the line that kind of delves into that. So would somebody mind sharing just a little bit, foreshadowing some of the projects that we're going to be working on these next few years?
Yeah, I mean, I can give it a shot, but Shelby and Jenny, please feel free to chime in. So one of the pieces I mentioned earlier, I mean, we are looking at the enrollment and retention rates for CPS graduates in 2020, and we have a data collaborative coming up about that in a few weeks, and then we'll be doing a more formal presentation like this, in addition to a formal report in the spring. We've been working for the last several years, as I mentioned, to understand leaves and transfers in college, both between 2-year and 4-year, and we've been trying to map all of those out in what we sometimes call pathways. We'll be releasing a tool on that and a report in the spring. We are also looking very closely at different institutions and trying to understand, and I saw there was a question about this, trying to understand, how different institutions are doing sort of by the students that they serve. And we know that different institutions in the city and that CPS students go to serve different students. And we want to understand a little bit more, what are the institutions that are doing well by students with, let's say, between a 2.0 and a 3.0, and what are the schools that are doing well by our Black graduates. Those are questions that I think are critical for us to understand in our sort of ecosystem, and so we're beginning to do some research on that, and we're hoping to add a lot of that data to our online tool in the next few years. Jenny and Shelby, anything else to add?
That covers it. So probably we have time for one quick question.
Yeah, I think last one to lean on. This is pretty broad, but there's a couple of questions that are I think I appreciate folks sharing some parts, surprised around some of the numbers, but also, some really clear recognition that that this data, could just be helpful outside of the education realm. So maybe just something to close on. What are some of the team's hopes for the PAI and how it can kind of drive some larger conversations in the city? And
I think like one of the hopes that we have and why we're doing this is that we really would like other districts, states, schools to also be using the PAI and provide points of comparison. I mean, right now, I think it was one of the questions that was asked us, we get asked a lot, is like, what does this look like in other districts? And for the most part, we have to say we don't know. And I think part of this is like, it's good to have points of comparison so we can benchmark performance. But I think it's also a way to spur conversations and think about practices and strategies across schools, districts, and states. Well, that's sort of my big hope around both today and the long-term future of the attainment indices.
We'll take it. I think it's a great one to close out on. Thank you all so much for joining us. Really appreciate everyone joining us again to engage in this conversation. Quick reminder, we are going to be continuing some conversation around this report on March 2nd. We'll be hosting our panel that focuses on the Black male experience in CPS. Hope you all are able to join us for that. And with that, please feel free to always reach out to our team. Happy to continue the conversation, and thanks for joining us.